Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 3, lecture 2. This one is going to be on what is called spatial orientations. We're thinking about the ways that we communicate about our places and in our places and spaces that we like to visit, or the spaces and places that we work in are altered by context, but then also how the context alters us as people and as a society or as a culture. So let me share the slideshow here. And yes, week 3, lecture 2, spatial orientations. So this one's based on this book chapter by Elise Verzosa Hurley. Spatial orientations, cultivating critical spatial perspectives in technical communication pedagogy. Pedagogy is just a big word here for like somebody's teaching strategies. So more like cultivating critical spatial perspectives in the teaching of technical communication might be a little bit simpler of a way to say it. Relative to the sort of scholarly research way. But she starts this chapter with just a story. She got her first job as a professor at Indiana State University, or Illinois State University, excuse me. And she writes, having only visited the Midwest once before during my whirlwind campus visit, meaning her interview, my entire spatial orientation changed. So when she got to Illinois State University, she notes that the landscape looks different from where she's looked before. It's harder to orient yourself to which way is north, east, and south, the cardinal directions, because you don't get as many geographical markers in the very flat lands of the American Midwest. And she says, yeah, my spatial orientation has changed. And maybe you can think about maybe when you moved to college, you realized, hey, I can't work in the same way that I used to. Now, maybe I like to find a coffee shop or a new coffee shop here in Newark that's different from my one at home. Maybe you found new ways of communicating, whether it was to fit in or, as you started to find a new voice through your college courses. But maybe this is familiar to you, but having her entire spatial orientation changed is the way that Hurley describes this. And so she says, I begin this chapter on integrating spatial perspectives in technical communication pedagogy with this narrative, the story she told, in order to underscore the ways in which the workings of our everyday lives, whether personal or professional, are comprised of numerous and overlapping spatial stories. And so again, we see this idea of technical writing, technical communication, and its theories or ideas surrounding us every day. And I think, as you know from our course so far, I think these topics really do surround us every day. And so she continues, the spatial turn in the disciplines of technical communication and rhetoric and writing studies has gained significant traction in recent years, all of which affirm that where communicative practices happen is just as important as how and why they happen. And so maybe you're reflecting a little bit here on last week when we talked about the rhetorical situation, and we talked about the ways in which what we communicate is changed, or maybe how somebody interprets what we're communicating changes in terms of our context, or what we might call our environment. And so she's saying this environment stuff, this context stuff, this is just as important as what is being said, and which medium we're using to communicate it. And I think she's right on this, and it probably goes without saying. But she's going to give us some vocabulary to think about, and these come kind of from writing studies. She says we can talk about technical writing, and maybe she's saying this has kind of already been done before. But she's highlighting these kinds of phrases that you can use to describe writing, like trenches, frontiers, landscapes, cities, contact zones, borderlands, architecture, margins, and sites, as words we might use to describe our writing, words that we might use to describe our spaces that are also used as metaphors for our writing. And so here's an example I really like. This was from a previous student who did the Tailor Your Syllabus assignment. And as you can see, she outlined different sort of boxes to contain each piece of information. And so we get the sense that each one is maybe its own individual site for picking up ideas for the course. We see in these margins kind of space to reflect or space to think between each different section, or maybe we can consider them borders and how they're separate from one another. And then at the end, if you kind of zoom out, maybe you think about the whole thing as having its own particular kind of architecture. And so these are the kinds of words that Hurley is pulling out here from writing studies. But she's going to say, hey, we need to look at these in kind of a new way to help both us as technical writing researchers and our students think about how space inflects technical communication. And so she continues by writing that cultural geographers and spatial theorists have made apparent that understanding the spatiality of everyday life is integral to understanding how the spaces and places we inhabit always already produce and are produced by social, cultural, ideological, and rhetorical meanings. And so let me just take a pause there. So in the lecture about the rhetorical situation, we thought about the medium that we write with, the message we're trying to communicate, and then we thought separately about the environment and the context. And so what I said just a second ago was that environment and context shape our message, maybe regardless of medium. But what Hurley is trying to get us to think about here, and maybe it is a different way of thinking about the rhetorical situation also, is that the words that we produce, the things we write, also change the social norms, the cultural identities, the ideologies of the places that we're in. And if we zoom out and look at certain kinds of texts, like ones made by cultural geographers, so maybe you could think about a map, and she says, when you think about this, you can probably pick out the cultural norms, the ideological norms of our society by looking at our maps. And so the places that you see particular architecture identify a particular thing about the identities of the people there. Maybe the distance of one group from, let's say a main street or a town hall, maybe that tells us something about the people who have been pushed to the perimeter, have been pushed to the margins, to use a word again that she teased out. And so she's starting to get us to think that, hey, wait a second, the way we communicate shapes these as much as they shape how and why we communicate. And so just some examples for you to think about I put there are thinking about policy or local laws, but one we might think about is the student handbook. It sets norms for how we're allowed to associate with our work, how we're allowed to associate with other individuals in the community. And if we took a step back and really read the student handbook, which I'm sure many of you have not, but if we actually took a step back in reading it, could we pick out, hey, what's cultural to University of Delaware? What kind of ideology does that institution have? That even in a technical writing, we would be able to see it, and then also say that that piece of technical writing maybe shapes the institution itself. And so Hurley puts together a graduate seminar project to get her students thinking about these same ideas. Unfortunately, we don't have the amount of time that a graduate seminar has, usually 15 weeks. And we don't have time to do all of the deep reading and theory stuff that they might have time to do. So I'm going to condense this assignment for hours, but here's what she did in her course with graduate students. She says, on the first day, I asked students to introduce themselves to one another through a mapping activity. Using Google Maps, I asked students to plot the spaces, places, and pathways they inhabit by prompting them to consider personally significant physical and conceptual spaces and places you inhabit regularly, spaces and places you rarely frequent or avoid, commonly traveled routes, and landmarks or monuments, literal or otherwise, that are important to you, that help you locate yourself. And so that's a full quote there. I'm not summarizing, but yeah, I think maybe if you think about campus, you think about it in these different kinds of ways. Like for some people, they might just see a residence hall, but for you, if that was your freshman dorm, you might have a different personally significant reason to remember it and think about it. Spaces and places rather you inhabit regularly. Maybe for some of you, being in a science lab is a regular part of your UD experience, where some of you have majors where maybe you've never been in a science lab. And so these two very different experiences with the spaces and places at the university can really change and shape them. And again, I'm using the university just as like an example that maybe we all know, but it's not specific to universities, or especially not specific to University of Delaware. But yeah, spaces and places you rarely frequent or avoid, and thinking about, is there a reason for that? Do they feel culturally distant from you, or maybe just unsafe for some reason tied to maybe your identity? And then commonly traveled routes and landmarks, these things we see every day. Maybe we start to stop thinking about them and we say that's just my way to class, but maybe there are cultural markers and identity markers along the way that we've forgotten about, but are still significant to us when we actually sit down and reflect on them. And so she had some exciting outcomes from her experiment in the classroom. She says it established from the outset of the course that seemingly straightforward, neutral, and objective technical documents such as maps are always partial, contingent, and culturally situated and open to multiple interpretations and understandings. And so again, that idea of what we're taking for granted in technical writing in our spaces, maybe that's not so simple. Maybe we need to think about those and think about bigger, broader definitions of what we're looking at. She says it allowed the students to consider the connections among the spaces and places they inhabit, as well as to those that they don't, and prompted them to reflect on the ways in which their relationships to spaces and places interact with their own embodied experiences and with social practices that are influenced by cultural and ideological beliefs, which are then mediated through an array of technologies and texts. And so I can break this down a little bit for you, but she's saying her experiment allowed them to consider the connections between the spaces and places. So when they maybe looked back on a route that they travel often, and they also looked at a landmark they use, maybe they found markers that are similar between these two things in a cultural sense, and maybe even the things that they kind of ignored. Maybe when they reflected on those, they realized, hey, I ignore or I avoid that for a particular reason. How that intersects with their own embodied experience. So again, thinking about identity, thinking about as a person, as a body traveling through a space, and with social practices that are influenced by cultural and ideological beliefs. And so not only being a body, but also being someone who is, identifies with their culture, identifies with their ideology. How does that shape maybe the places we go to and avoid? And then she says these are also mediated by an array of technologies and texts. So again, to get back to the writing part, when does Google Maps bring me to a particular place, and do I want to be there? Do I identify with that place or not? And then does our technical writing align with those very same components of a space? And then lastly, she writes, their maps served as concrete references to spaces and places with which they had some working familiarity. They were useful in helping them to grapple with a highly theoretical spatial concept that we engaged in our reading and discussions. And so, again, we don't have much time to do all the readings and all the discussions that we might do in a 15-week course. I might, in that situation, assign a full day to an article like this. But what I'll do in, I think, assignment 2 and discussion 3, don't quote me on that, but what I'll do is I'll get us to start thinking about our spaces and our places and our routes and think about maybe how we can describe them to people who maybe have the same cultural background as us or same educational experience as us versus somebody who maybe is an outsider to that culture. Again, I wish we could do kind of a full thing like Hurley did with all those different components, but maybe we'll just zoom in on one and think about how those spaces inflect our writing and then how our writing inflect those spaces. So thanks for listening to this one, and I'll have one more lecture for you this week. Thanks, everyone.